This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A man who's been sitting on death row for over 2 decades was denied a new trial last week in a highly publicized and controversial case known as the Stocking Stranglings. The case dates back to the late 1970s. A serial killer in Columbus, Georgia, raped and murdered several elderly white women by strangling them in their beds. In 1986, 8 years after the last murder, an African-American man, Carlton Gary, was convicted and sentenced to death for 3 of the murders. No physical evidence was ever produced to tie him to the crimes. Gary's been on death row ever since. In 2005, a new piece of evidence that had been missing for 20 years, a bite mark mold taken from the last victim, was presented. Gary's attorney argued that the mold did not match his teeth, and it was evidence that pointed to his client's innocence. But last Wednesday, U.S. District Court Judge Clay Land ruled the mold doesn't cast enough doubt on Gary's case to undermine the '86 conviction. Carlton Gary's case now goes to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta. Award-winning journalist David Rose has followed this case for more than 10 years and just published the book, The Big Eddie Club, The Stocking Stranglings and Southern Justice. David Rose is a contributing editor at Vanity Fair and has worked for The Guardian, The Observer, and the BBC. He's the author of 5 previous books, including Guantanamo. David Rose joined me in the Firehouse studio last week, just 2 days before Judge Land's latest ruling on the bite mark mold, to talk about the case and the significance of this piece of evidence.
Right now, the case is at an absolutely critical stage. Perhaps the most important piece of evidence that I've dug up is a bite cast made from the killer's teeth. The story behind this is extraordinary. At the trial, the defense attorney, Bud Seaman, who had no money, could see from the photo of one of the victims, Janet Kofer, that she had been bitten savagely by the murderer, and there was a very distinctive pattern of tooth marks on her breast. And so we asked the judge, can we get an expert to compare this photo with Carlton Gary's teeth, because it looked like, you know, these teeth were very jumbled up. And Carlton Gary was a very good-looking guy. Unlike most serial killers, he had a number of successful relationships with women. He'd even worked as a model. At the time of these murders, he was appearing 5 times a night on television, modeling clothes, and I've always thought that makes him unique among alleged serial killers, that he was actually, you know, it's very easy to identify someone if you've seen him on TV. You don't have to give a vague description to the cops. You say, it's that guy, the guy who's in those commercials. Well, of course, nothing happened with that at the trial, but then later, in the 90s, the defense attorney who represented him at his state appeal, Jeff Ertel, thought he'd revisit this issue, and he went to Atlanta, or he lived in Atlanta. He found that in Atlanta was an expert in the field of forensic odontology called Thomas David, and he might be able to compare the photo with the bite, with Carlton Gary's bite. And, well, he called Dr. David, and he said, I know about this case, come and see me straight away. And it turned out that Ricky Boren, the former chief detective of Columbus, now the chief of police, the district attorney Bill Smith at the time, and his assistant Doug Pullen, both men now Superior Court judges, had come to see him before Carlton Gary's trial with a cast that had been made by a local dentist of the killer's teeth. And they said to him, if this matches our suspect, you know, is this good evidence? Can you testify that this means he's the killer? And he said, yeah, that's pretty good. If that matches, you have the right guy. And then they said, very strange question. They said, and if it doesn't match, would you be able to testify that this doesn't necessarily exclude him? And he said, no, if that doesn't match him, you have the wrong man. This would exclude him. And they said, just forget this meeting ever happened. Don't tell anybody about it. Well, years passed, he told the defense. The defense contacted the dentist in Columbus who had made the bite. Very strangely, he told them that the cops had given it back to him. They hadn't kept it in an exhibit store, this potentially critical piece of evidence. They'd given it back to him. And he said, well, can I come and see it? And the dentist, Carlos Galbraith, said, sure, come by next week. Well, Jeff Ertel, the defense lawyer, and a colleague went to see the dentist, and he said, I'm so sorry, I can't find it. I think I destroyed it 5 years ago. And that seemed to be the end of the matter. But then, a number of years ago, about 2001, I went to see the dentist, and I said, Dr. Galbraith, what happened with that bite cast? Why did you destroy it? And he looked at me and he said, I didn't destroy it. I know it's still in existence. And I said, well, why did you say you couldn't find it back in the early 90s? And he said, well, you see, the district attorney at the time, Doug Pullen, he's my best buddy. We go bird shooting every Sunday. We have done for the last 30 years. And he showed me he'd blown the top of 3 of his fingers off, bird shooting with Doug Pullen. And that's why he'd shut down his practice. And he said, When the defense attorney called me, I called Doug, and I said, Doug, what should I do? This guy wants to come and see the bike cast. And Doug, he said, told him, you tell him any story you want, but don't let him see that bike cast. Tell him, a very strange phrase, I don't know quite what it means. He said, tell him his reputation precedes him and he can't see the bike cast. Astonishingly, he repeated this in an affidavit, and this was filed with a federal court. And then this hunt began for the bike cast, and all kinds of people testified that they couldn't find it. The dentist said he'd given it to the coroner, who had said who had in fact passed away. His family said they couldn't find it, although they said they remembered seeing it. They said he used to take it out and show visitors and say, these are the Stocking Strangler's teeth, but it was going nowhere. And then finally, at the end of 2005, at a point when Carlton Gary's case had left the district court, it was now in the 11th Circuit. He'd lost the first stage of his federal appeal. It wasn't looking good for him. It was just a few days before he was due in the 11th Circuit Court in Atlanta for what would have been probably his last appeal. Suddenly, the Assistant Attorney General of Georgia, Susan Bolin, who conducts death penalty appeals on behalf of the state, called Carlton Gary's lawyers and said, the folks in Columbus have found that bike cast. All last year, it was analyzed, and Dr. David, the same expert, photographed it from every which way under a high-resolution microscope. He made a cast of Carlton Gary's teeth. And finally, on February the 14th of this year, there was an evidentiary hearing in Columbus at which the expert testified that this bike cast excluded him to a level of reasonable scientific certainty. And we're waiting for the judge. And there is another aspect to this, which is just extraordinary. In my book, I've not just talked about the case, I've talked about the whole kind of history of race relations in Columbus, Georgia. And I've gone back to even before the Civil War and shown, I think, how that history of violence and racism and oppression has fed into this case. But there is one incredible thread that runs through it, which is the role of a single family. Begins with a man called Aaron Brewsterland, who was responsible for two absolutely horrendous lynchings in the early part of the 1900s. We move to his son, John Land. John Land covers up the death of the black civil rights leader in Columbus, Thomas H. Brewer, in 1956. And he then makes the decisions in Carlton Gary's case, by the time of which, of course, he's become a judge. He had been the district attorney in 56. He makes the decisions which deny Carlton Gary funding for his trial. And now it's his great nephew, who is the federal judge, who holds Carlton Gary's fate in his hand. It's Judge Clayland of the Federal Court of Columbus, who now has to decide whether to give him a new trial. So there's this extraordinary continuity of more than a century, and this one family kind of represents this, and it's down to Clayland to decide whether to do the right thing.
David Rose, investigative reporter, author of The Big Eddie Club. We'll come back to him in a minute.